In 2074, the discovery of time travel has occurred, but its usage is prohibited and limited to the underground market. Whenever the mafia wants to eliminate someone, they dispatch their target to a point 30 years in the past, where skilled assassins, referred to as loopers, patiently await to eradicate their assigned targets. If you want to stay in the loop and receive more exciting videos, make sure to subscribe, click the notification bell, and don't forget to like the video. In the year 2044, the United States has experienced an economic collapse, leading to widespread social decay and the rise of organized crime. Adding to the turmoil, a peculiar mutation has affected 10% of the population, granting them minor telekinetic abilities, demonstrated through their capacity to levitate small objects. Fast forward to 2074, 30 years in the future, when time travel has been invented only to be swiftly outlawed. However, due to advanced tracking technology making it nearly impossible to dispose of bodies covertly, future crime bosses resort to using time travel to dispatch their targets to the past. The victims, bound and bagged, are sent through the time machine and transported back to the year 2044, where they are promptly executed by hired contract killers known as loopers. Loopers collect their payment by retrieving bars of silver attached to the victims' backs. Working as a looper comes with a caveat: the stringent regulations on time travel dictate that crime bosses will eventually need to terminate a looper's contract and erase any evidence of their collaboration. When this occurs, if the looper is still alive in 2074, they are sent back in time to be killed by their younger selves, a process known as closing one's loop. Loopers become aware of this event when their victim bears bars of gold instead of the usual silver. Once a looper's loop is closed, they are freed from their contract and granted 30 years to live in comfort. Joseph "Joe" Simmons, played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, works as a looper for a mafia organization in Kansas City. Joe's boss, Abe, portrayed by Jeff Daniels, was sent back in time to oversee the loopers and also owns a club where Joe frequently visits and spends time with Susie, played by Piper Perabo, a showgirl. Abe, wanting more than just looper operations, has recruited enforcers in the present day to aid in running his criminal empire. These individuals, known as Gat Men, led by a man named Kid Blue, portrayed by Noah Segan, derive their name from the powerful Magnum revolvers they carry, which surpass the loopers' short-range shotguns called blunderbusses in terms of range and accuracy. As Joe continues his work, he and the other loopers begin to notice a surge in the number of loops being closed. Events reach a critical point when one night, Seth, portrayed by Paul Dano, Joe's friend and fellow looper, visits him in a state of panic, confessing that he failed to close his loop as expected. Seth reveals that when his older self appeared, he was singing a song his mother had sung to him as a baby, making it difficult for him to carry out the execution. However, the older Seth informed him that a new crime boss known as the Rainmaker has emerged in the future and is now closing all the loops. Before Seth can provide more information, the Gat Men arrive at Joe's door, forcing him to conceal Seth in his apartment's floor safe. The Gat Men suspect Joe of harboring Seth, leading them to take Joe to Abe for questioning. Abe strikes a deal with Joe, offering him freedom if he reveals Seth's whereabouts. However, instead of killing Joe, they decide to make his life difficult by confiscating half of the silver he has been saving for his retirement in France, knowing it would greatly impact him. Without hesitation, Joe sacrifices Seth and divulges his location. Eventually, Joe is released and treated to a complimentary lap dance from Susie, while Abe instructs Kid Blue to contact the doc to seek vengeance on Seth. Meanwhile, old Seth attempts to scale a barbed wire fence but notices peculiar scars forming on his arm, forming words that guide him to a specific address. Ignoring the message, he witnesses his right pinky finger vanish. Shortly after, his ring and middle fingers disappear as well. Frightened, old Seth returns to his car and urgently drives to the provided address. As he arrives, his right foot disappears, causing him to lose control and crash. Frantically, he limps toward the address, but both of his legs vanish, leaving him crawling on the ground. Desperately, he pounds on the door. Within seconds, Kid Blue opens the door and shoots him dead. Joe continues to carry out his killings as planned. After each execution, he visits a diner and studies French. A waitress named Beatrix serves him there, portrayed by Tracy Toms. While awaiting his next assignment, Joe becomes puzzled when the intended target is late. When the person finally arrives, Joe is taken aback as he realizes it's his older self, played by Bruce Willis. In a tense standoff, Old Joe attempts to shoot young Joe. However, Old Joe swiftly turns around, using the gold bars strapped to his back to deflect the bullet. Seizing a gold bar, he hurls it at young Joe, rendering him unconscious with a powerful punch. Upon regaining consciousness, he discovers a note advising him to leave town. Ignoring the warning, Joe returns to his apartment only to find the Gat Men ransacking it and seizing his silver. He manages to trap Kid Blue in the floor safe, but another Gat Man wounds him, causing Joe to fall from the fire escape and land on a parked car, losing consciousness. At this juncture, the film pauses to provide us with a glimpse into the timeline from which Old Joe originates. In this timeline, Joe fulfills his loop and follows Abe's advice to relocate to Shanghai. Despite managing to save up half of his earnings in silver, Joe exhausts his funds within a decade due to excessive drug use and a lavish partying lifestyle. By 2054, he resorts to working as a contract killer for local criminal organizations. Over the next 13 years, he experiences hair loss, leaving him mostly bald. In 2067, he encounters a stunning and compassionate woman who helps him overcome his addiction. 2 years later, they marry, and he settles down. Life remains relatively peaceful for the following 3 years, until 2074. One morning, 3 armed men wearing wide-brimmed hats invade Joe's residence. They abduct him, set his house on fire, and transport him to the time machine to send him back in time to close his loop. Despite being restrained with zip ties, Joe manages to free himself, remove his hood, and eliminate his attackers. He then enters the time machine. The subsequent events are shown from Old Joe's perspective, revealing that he knocked out young Joe, stole his truck, obtained first aid supplies and new clothes from a drugstore, and arrived at young Joe's apartment. Upon witnessing young Joe falling from the balcony, Old Joe promptly saves him by eliminating the Gat Man who was shooting at him before disappearing once again. Old Joe conducts research on enigmatic numbers at the library when letters start forming on his right arm, spelling out Beatrix. It turns out to be a message from young Joe, instructing him to meet at the diner. They order identical meals. Old Joe asks young Joe about his progress in learning French and then says in French, "I know you have a gun under the table pointed at me." When young Joe fails to comprehend, Old Joe reassures him, saying, "It's okay that you didn't understand everything. You will." He proceeds to provide Joe with more information about the Rainmaker. The Rainmaker emerged seemingly out of nowhere and swiftly seized control of all major crime syndicates within 6 months. He is responsible for numerous mass executions and the eradication of vagrants. Moreover, he issued orders to close all loops. Old Joe's wife was inadvertently killed by syndicate members when Old Joe was captured. Shortly before Old Joe was sent back in time, his fellow looper colleague, Old Dale, shared a numerical sequence that hints at uncovering the Rainmaker's identity. Old Joe knows that in Joe's present time, the child who will eventually become the Rainmaker resides in the same county. If Old Joe can eliminate the Rainmaker, he would prevent his own capture and ensure his wife's survival. The altercation ensues when Old Joe realizes that young Joe intends to eliminate him, but it doesn't take long for both Joes to notice the sudden disappearance of the diner's occupants. Suddenly, a group of armed men bursts in and launches a surprise attack. Amidst the chaos, Old Joe hands Joe a fragment of a map with an address and a series of numbers, revealing that the Rainmaker may reside there. While under fire, Old Joe flees and instructs Joe to pursue the lead. The Gat Men then turn their attention to young Joe, who also escapes their gunfire. Managing to elude his pursuers, young Joe follows the coordinates to a farmhouse belonging to Sarah, Emily Blunt, who lives there with her son Sid Harrington, Pierce Gagnon. When Joe presents the map to Sarah, she recognizes the numbers as Sid's birth date and the hospital serial number, prompting young Joe to explain the situation regarding the Rainmaker. Using the database old Joe accessed with the number sequence, 3 potential children born on the same day in the same hospital are identified, and old Joe is determined to eliminate them. Sarah cautions Sid to stay away from Joe, but Sid's curiosity leads him to befriend Joe and share his electronic equipment. Sid demonstrates his impressive skills in building transmitters, enabling Joe and Sarah to communicate with each other. Meanwhile, old Joe tracks down one of the potential Rainmaker candidates on his way to a birthday party and kills him. However, when he realizes that he still exists in his past, he breaks down in tears. He has eliminated the wrong child. He then proceeds to the location of the other child but hesitates upon realizing that it is where Susie, his former love interest from 30 years ago, resides with her son. Instead of immediately targeting the child, he covertly observes their apartment. As young Joe and Sarah grow closer, he learns that she possesses telekinetic powers slightly stronger than other individuals with similar abilities. Sarah explains that Sid was raised by her sister for 2 years until her sister was inexplicably killed. Sid believes Sarah's sister was his mother and refuses to accept Sarah as his real mother. Sarah's fear of Sid is evident as she retreats to her room and seeks refuge in a safe when Sid becomes angry, convinced that she is lying about being his mother. The following day, Jesse, one of the Gat Men portrayed by Garrett Dillahunt, arrives in search of Joe. Sid assists Joe in evading Jesse, and Jesse eventually departs. While hiding from Jesse, Joe reveals to Sid that his own mother abandoned him to the panhandlers, resulting in his upbringing without her. Moments later, Joe discloses that his mother sold him and was involved with drugs. Joe's lack of a mother figure led him down a path of becoming a killer, a drug user, and eventually a looper. Suspicion towards Sarah arises in Jesse, prompting his return and the threatening of Sarah at gunpoint as Joe descends the stairs. Joe tries to reason with Jesse, but the situation intensifies when Sid starts descending the stairs and startles Jesse. In a fit of rage, Sid falls down the stairs and unleashes a powerful telekinetic blast, killing Jesse. Sid's extraordinary telekinetic abilities confirm to Joe that Sid is, indeed, the Rainmaker and that Sarah's sister fell victim to Sid's uncontrollable powers. Joe finds Sid crying in the sugarcane fields and consoles him. With Sarah's guidance, Joe realizes that this boy needs love and may not become the Rainmaker if raised in a nurturing environment. Meanwhile, Kid Blue successfully tracks down old Joe to Susie's apartment and apprehends him as old Joe attempts to harm the child. Young Joe instructs Sarah and Sid to flee, anticipating that his employers and or old Joe will target the farm. Old Joe manages to escape, eliminating Abe and all the other Gat Men except for Kid Blue, who sustains a foot injury. As the two versions of Joe confront each other near Sarah's house, Kid Blue launches an attack but is ultimately killed by young Joe. Sarah and Sid try to escape in a vehicle, but old Joe begins shooting at their truck. Sid urges Sarah to halt the vehicle to prevent them from getting closer, but instead, she accelerates in an attempt to run over old Joe. Fearful, Sid employs his telekinetic powers to flip the truck. Both Sid and Sarah endeavor to seek refuge in the sugarcane fields. Old Joe attempts to shoot them, grazing Sid's cheek with a bullet. In another fit of rage, Sid employs a powerful telekinetic blast, suspending Sarah and old Joe in midair. Young Joe had been trailing old Joe in his truck when it was toppled by the telekinetic blast. Sarah reassures Sid, repeatedly expressing her love for him and assuring him that everything will be fine. Sid calms down, ceasing his telekinetic outburst. Sarah embraces Sid, and he addresses her as Mom for the first time. As old Joe regains his composure, he grabs his gun, preparing to shoot Sid. Acting quickly, Sarah sends Sid into the sugarcane fields and positions herself as a shield, preventing old Joe from firing. In the tense moment before the potential shooting, young Joe has a sudden time flash and realizes that the cycle of revenge is stuck in an endless loop. He envisions old Joe shooting Sarah directly in the heart. Sid escapes through the sugarcane fields and boards a passing freight train. In essence, old Joe's actions will create a bitter child who will become the rainmaker, deprived of his mother's love. To break this cycle, young Joe makes a decisive choice. He promptly shoots himself with his blunderbuss, effectively closing the loop from his end. Sarah tenderly tucks Sid into bed after tending to the cut on his face caused by old Joe's gunshot. She then ventures back to the sugarcane field and notices an array of gold bars scattered around the overturned truck. This unexpected wealth ensures that both she and Sid will be well provided for. Approaching young Joe's lifeless body lying in the field, Sarah takes a moment to caress his hair, a gesture he had confided in Susie that his own mother used to do for him.